All right, we are back for the 77th episode of the Mack on Politics podcast. I am thrilled to have in studio for a live version of the podcast, which is being live cast at the WashingtonTimes.com website and also on their Facebook page, facebook.com/The Washington Times. Our first cabinet secretary in the history of the podcast, and a man who's very much in the news right now, EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt. Administrator, how are you?
Good afternoon to you guys. Good to be with you.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. I appreciate it.
I can't believe I'm the first.
You're the first.
We've had hitter, huh?
We've had two of your colleagues from Oklahoma on the podcast. Former Senator Coburn was on, and we talked to him, and also your current Senator Lankford was on. So
Tom's a good friend and served Oklahoma and this country very ably and very well.
Absolutely, and term limited himself and was very focused on fiscal issues and is really a patriot. So that was a great conversation. I know we'll have a great conversation here. I'm going to actually flip this in terms of the way that a lot of Washington interviews are. Instead of going to some of the things I think that people might be tuning in to try to hear about, we're going to do that. We're going to do that a little later. What I really wanted to do in talking to you was to talk about your job and what you're trying to do at EPA and why those things matter. And I think sometimes in Washington, Charlie and I were talking about this beforehand, people focus on distractions and not on issues. And I know you've been very focused on your mission as EPA Administrator. I guess let me start by asking you, how do you think the work is going from a policy and an issue standpoint? How do you think it's going, particularly compared to what you thought you could achieve in the first 15, 16 months?
Look, I've been extremely encouraged. And when you look at, we did a year-end review and then published that recently, over 22 significant regulatory actions in 1 year. Totaling $1 billion in savings as far as regulatory reform.
Right.
Now, President Trump has led a regulatory reform agenda administration-wide that exhibited $8 billion of savings in 1 year. We were $1 billion of that. But there was tremendous opportunity at the agency, obviously, to address those issues. Because what's happened over the last several years, I think, as you all know, in my view, and I think others, is the agency was weaponized against certain sectors of our economy, declaring winners and losers in the economy, coercive in how they were doing rulemaking. And really untethered to statutes, abusing process like the sue and settle practices that we have fixed. And so you had just this constant, uncertainty with the regulated community, not knowing what's expected of them. Because think about it, if you have a statute that says one thing, under the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, whatever the case may be, and then you have a rule like the Waters of the United States rule or the Clean Power Plan, the alleged Clean Power Plan rule of the past administration that are untethered to the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, respectively. What do you do if you're regulated? Do you follow the regulation or do you follow the statute? And that's what caused all of this confusion in the marketplace. Courts intervened, stayed those. So what we're doing is really clearing the deck and providing clarity, addressing those deficient rules, and then providing confidence going forward that we're going to respect process and rule of law. And it's yielding significant dividends. I mean, the optimism, the encouragement that I hear across the country, the twin pillars of tax cuts with regulatory reform is the actual fuel behind this economy. And this president, in a year, if you look back, it's extraordinary what he's accomplished in his first year. And we've seen that at the EPA.
Yeah, and you're in the unique position, perhaps maybe Governor Perry would understand the position you're in as well, as someone who was dealing with the federal government but doing it from a state position. But having been Attorney General of Oklahoma, and I know this having been in Texas, because in many cases you were partnering with our Attorney General in Texas, Greg Abbott, and then Ken Paxton, to sue EPA and sue other federal agencies. But you are in a unique position to have seen how EPA was, from your perspective and from, I think, the perspective of a lot of people, overreaching, certainly as it relates to state issues and, as you mentioned, regulation, to then become the head of that agency. That is how unique is that to go from being in a position to sue an agency that's overreaching to then being asked to take on leadership of that agency?
I think it exemplifies the leadership of this president, putting people in positions in the cabinet, leading agencies to get results. I mean, I don't think he gets enough credit with respect to the empowerment that he gives each of us to go advance the agenda. And what he's exhibited is courage to take on very tough issues. The Paris Accord, as an example, had been baked in for a number of years. There was tremendous, push to stay in that, although it didn't put America first. And the president stood in the Rose Garden and had the courage and fortitude to say it's not good for this country, and we're leading the world in GHG reduction anyway. So we don't have anything to be apologetic about. That took tremendous courage. And then to put people in positions at Interior, at EPA prayerfully, and others to say, go get the job done, to provide the regulatory clarity to those across the country, advance the issues, advance environmental protection, which we're doing, but do so with common sense. I found that there's not too much common sense. Common sense is not too common, I guess, at the agency. But,
Right.
but the point is this: it's really, I think, important to be able to fix those things, and I think we're fixing those things at the agency. We're doing it the right way. Look, from a executive branch standpoint, Matt, I think what was lost in the past administration, we only have the authority that Congress gives us. And the past administration pinch hit for Congress.
Right.
You take the Waters of the United States rule, what do? They change the definition of a water of the United States to extend jurisdiction over dry creek beds and puddles across the country.
Right.
They reimagine authority under the Clean Air Act, Section 111, with respect to emissions from power generation facilities. And the U.S. Supreme Court did something they've never done, unprecedented. They intervened and issued a stay against that while the case was pending at the lower court level. That's unheard of. Never happened before. So they truly acted in ways that were inconsistent with their authority, creating confusion and uncertainty, slowing the economy down. This administration has taken a completely different view. Start with the rule of law, emphasize process, provide clarity, get deregulation, and the economy is taking off, and good outcomes are happening for the environment.
You talked about the Trump working with the president and the directive that he's given to the administration, to the cabinet, to carry out the agenda. I mean, talk about what that's like. What is it like working in this administration? How do you think the president's doing on a day-to-day basis? Obviously, your purview is somewhat narrow, and that there's a lot of issues that are being addressed, national security issues, immigration, things that may not directly affect EPA, but you do have a good mandate there to get things done, and you've been, as you said, very active. But what is it like working with him, and how do you think President Trump is doing?
America is safer today, and it's more prosperous today in a very short time frame. And I think if you ask most Americans that were concerned about that prior to November 8th of 2016, and you look at the results that have happened since that time, it is quite remarkable. So it's I don't want to say breathtaking, but it approaches that. And so I think the president has truly empowered his respective leaders in these various cabinet positions to go out and advance. He's all about results, about action. I've heard stories of previous administrations that would take so many layers, of getting a rule through, of different people weighing in, and just how laborious the process was. This president is all about accelerating and velocity and talking about 3 to 4% growth. And another area that we've talked about a lot about is permitting. Right. The president and I've talked about permitting, and our agency didn't even know how long it took to get through permitting before we arrived. I asked career officials upon arrival, tell me how long it takes us to process a permit. They didn't even know. And when we studied it last year, I know this is going to be shocking, it took forever. I mean, a lot of years. And so we are reforming those processes now, Charlie and Matt, and guess what's happening? By the end of 2018, every permit that we decide upon will be up or down in 6 months.
Wow.
States do it. We can do it. It's a matter of setting priorities and getting accountability, and it's happening.
You mentioned the weaponization of the EPA, and obviously you saw this take place from the outside. Now that you're on the inside, can you give any examples or describe kind of how the shocking degree to which the previous administration and previous administrations have weaponized the EPA?
Yeah, I think that the greatest examples are the rules, the Waters of the United States rule and the so-called Clean Power Plan. Both of those rules adopted by the previous administration were truly coercive. The first one, the Waters of the United States, was all about power. When you come in and stress the definition of a water of the United States so far as to include a dry creek bed, a puddle, an ephemeral drainage ditch, that is something totally foreign to the Clean Water Act. And it was all about making sure that as land use decisions were being made in states across the country, that the first stop for permission was going to be Washington, D.C. I was in Salt Lake City mid last year looking at a subdivision that was being built. It was with the governor, and there was an Army Corps of Engineers representative that was with me, Charlie. And he pointed to an ephemeral drainage ditch that made up this subdivision that was being built. And he said, Scott, that is a water of the United States. Now think about that. An ephemeral drainage ditch as part of a subdivision, saying that was going to be a water of the United States. That's what we're getting fixed. So when we talk about overreach and the weaponization, I mean, look, where is it in the statutes that an agency of the federal government could declare war against a sector of our economy, the war on coal that the president ended, the war on fossil fuels? When you look at our power grid and the generation of electricity, we need more fuel diversity, not less. And so those are examples where I think the agency was using regulatory power in a coercive way to try to manipulate and dictate to the markets, and do so inconsistent with the authority under the statute.
But one of the things that's so curious to me is because if farmers, if you're around landowners, they have been outraged by this waters of the U.S. thing since it first just happened. But the thing that has always baffled me is how the lack of outrage among sort of normal, regular people about that. Why is that? Why? How does that fly under the radar?
Well, I mean, home builders know about it. You know, oil and gas, farmers and ranchers. I mean, people that were using their land, they were facing the uncertainty of going out and using their land and then finding out years into the future, you should have got a permit from the EPA because you had to water the United States.
Well, it's essentially taking their land away from them.
Absolutely. And so, look, that's why I've said consistently, I'll say it again today, the Waters of the United States rule that was adopted was not about clean water. It was about power. It was about jurisdiction. And it was about Washington, D.C. interposing itself upon all those decisions across the country. And we're fixing that. I mean, the response, February 28th of last year, the president, on the day that he addressed the joint session of Congress, was in the Roosevelt Room signing an executive order saying to me, Scott, go fix this. Within 8 minutes of him signing that executive order, I had the paperwork in place to start that process. And then I went across town and met with the farmers and ranchers you're talking about, Charlie. Yeah. There were about 600 to 700 farmers and ranchers. And to your point, they were ecstatic with the president's leadership and that we were fixing that very deficient and rule that was focused on power.
And they, quite frankly, so many people had just assumed this was something they would never get rid of.
That's right.
No one would ever get elected in Washington who understood how nefarious this thing was.
And he truly is putting America first in these areas. He's listening to people that have not been listened to in a long time. And I think that goes to your point that you're making. There was a sense of hopelessness. There was a sense of despair. There was a sense of saying, we can't really make a difference in this process. This president has given hope to those individuals that say it's going to be different, taking on the status quo, taking on the establishment. I mean, look, you all see this every day. The amount of energy and the change that's taking place in the compressed time frame. I mean, have you ever seen it before?
No, nothing like it.
No, I mean, I've written columns about that in the Washington Times. I mean, how much the president did get done in the first year. Certainly the tax reform law took it to a different level. But, staying kind of within the issues that are really within your purview, which have real significance, I know an issue that you focused on a lot, and I don't know that you're getting probably enough credit for it, is Superfund sites.
Yeah.
One of the things about that is you would think that the Democratic administrations would be super focused on Superfunds, on getting those sites cleaned up, some that have been there for decades. Really quite outrageous situations. Talk about that issue of why you focused on that, why you've been more successful than your predecessors have been.
Matt, this goes back to a question Charlie was talking about a second ago. What was most striking to me as I came into this position was the lack of urgency around issues that you would think, and you've mentioned one, where it would just be fundamental that they would be moving with deliberate speed to get accountability and get change and get remediation in these sites and cleanup. This wasn't. It was languishing. I mean, 1,340 plus sites across the country in the Superfund portfolio. We have sites that have been listed on the national priority list. That list where we say these are some of the most egregious sites in the country that must be cleaned up. They've been listed since the 1980s. Without cleanup, we had a situation in Westlake, Missouri, where a site was listed in 1990. When I came into this position last year, 27 years later, the agency still had not made a decision on how to clean up. Not clean up. Do we excavate or do we cap? So there was so we're getting. I instituted a task force April, May of last year and said, look, we've got to focus on this. 42 recommendations came out. We saw 7 sites come off the list last year. We're going to see approaching 30 this year. That's never been done. We're getting accountability and cleanup. In the St. Louis example, told the folks in St. Louis, it's unacceptable that it's taken 27 years for a decision. We'll get it done in 6 months. I announced that in January of this year. The uranium that makes up at that site is going to be removed in less than 5 years. That poses risk to the health of the citizens of St. Louis. Right. The community there, as we announced that, literally moms in attendance started crying because of the response that we. So we're getting very good things. But I'll give you an example: lead in our drinking water. It's a concern. A tremendous concern on the health risk to our children, the mental acuity levels of our children. So we have aged infrastructure on the East Coast particularly, but in rural communities across the country where corrosion control measures and the infrastructure is not what it should be. And so lead is leaching into the water, the drinking water, and is causing substantial concerns. You would think that would be a major priority, right?
Yeah.
It hasn't been. I mean, we have a lead and copper rule that was adopted in 1990. When I arrived at the agency had been working 10 years to update the rule and not finished. So this is these are the kind of things I was shocked by. Why does it take 10 years to update a lead and copper rule? So we've got that as a focus. How do we focus on infrastructure, through a warfare program to make sure that infrastructure mitigating lead exposure happens so that we don't see Gold King and we don't see Flint, Michigan? How do we advance Superfund, and get sites off the list? So those are all metrics and objectives that we're setting and we're measuring every single day, and it's never happened at the agency. And that's how you can deregulate, save cost. We're at Reagan era levels right now with our staff size, and we're getting more done. So I'm very optimistic about where we're heading.
Is that a question of priorities? I mean, the fact that a previous administration wouldn't have been as focused on what you would presume the environmentalists would want, things like lead, things like Superfund.
I just think it takes hard work, to get to answers, to bring these things to a position of an answer, and then making a decision. I think that there was an unwillingness to actually take decisive action. Let's just keep studying it, because when you make decisions, there's accountability.
Yeah,
and I think the past administration was more interested in going to Paris and having bumper sticker kind of issues, and being apologetic for this country, as opposed to championing what we'd actually accomplished with CO2 reductions. People don't know this. We're at pre-1994 levels today in our CO2 footprint, largely through innovation and technology and not government mandate. We reduced our CO2 footprint by almost 20% from the years 2000 to 2014 after we exited Kyoto. So we have nothing to be apologetic about.
Explain some of the challenges. I would imagine it's tough. A lot of what you're talking about was carried out by the very people who now work for you. They're working for a very different boss now, and you have to bring them along to see your vision of things. How hard is that?
Look, I think the responsiveness in some of these areas, it's actually been exciting to see some career individuals feel validated again, and like the Superfund portfolio that Matt was just talking about, it's been dormant to a certain degree. To enliven those people, those career individuals have come up to me several times the last several months saying thank you for listening. They just haven't been a focus, and so it's really a different dynamic, Charlie, and it can get exciting. It can get exciting when you say, okay, we're at 40% non-attainment across the country. Where do we want to be 5 years from now? We had Gold Key in Flint, Michigan. Where do we want to be on water infrastructure, Superfund remediation? Let's set these objectives and measure it every day. People can get excited about that, and I'm encouraged about the response internally.
But the team that was in charge of pushing waters of the U.S., they can't be so excited.
Look, I mean, I think that yes. I mean, what was challenging for me to that point is I didn't have a general counsel in December till December this year, the last year. I still don't have a deputy, by the way.
Right.
So what has been challenging for me is navigating, and I have been personally involved in the navigating of those issues from a rulemaking perspective, and holding the team accountable to make sure that we're advancing. That has been very challenging because of the personnel issues. And you're right, there are individuals that their worldview on these matters are different, and sometimes it can cause delay, and that's the reason I've had to push through. But the biggest challenge we've had, Charlie, in my view, with respect to your question, is not the navigation around the rules, but an attitude that says, and I think this is an attitude that was alive and well before we arrived, that that environmental protection was prohibition. That though we've been blessed with all these natural resources, natural gas, coal, the rest, they saw the job of the agency as what? Put up fences and say, do not touch. So one of the things that I'm trying to reorient thinking toward is prohibition is never where we've been as a country. We have an obligation to feed the world, and we have an obligation to power the world. The president has talked about energy dominance. We can actually achieve that. So our goal should be what? Stewardship, not prohibition. I believe to whom much is given, much is required. We should use those natural resources and have stewardship mentality for future generations in mind. You mentioned farmers and ranchers earlier. They're our first conservationists, first environmentalists. Yeah. And so why not partner with them to achieve good outcomes for water quality, but also use our land to feed the world?
And the notion that a bureaucrat in Washington cares more about the land than the guy that farms his cattle on this land has always been sort of the height of arrogance and hypocrisy.
I believe absolutely that's the case, and we're fixing that.
So you had announcement just I think you had a Sunday night deadline, if I remember correctly, related to CAFE standards related to Obama administration, I believe, requiring that cars go up to 54 miles a gallon by 2025, a pretty high number. Talk about what that means going forward. I guess there's a process now that this is not the end. This is actually the beginning of that process.
Well, I mean, two things. One, The president, one of the first things he did, on this particular issue, is he invited the auto sector to the White House last year in February, and then went to Detroit in March and announced that the midterm evaluation was going to occur consistent with the timeline that was agreed to when these standards were put in place. One of the things that I don't think people really recognize is when the Obama administration, EPA and DOT set those standards, they set them in 2011 timeframe and then took them all the way through 2025. 14 approximate years on that time frame. That's a long period. That had not been done before. And so as that occurred, what they agreed to was a midterm evaluation to determine whether those standards were appropriate. It would occur in April of 2018. When the President Obama was leaving office in January of 2017, they did it 16 months early. They actually issued a midterm evaluation that was supposed to take place this month. They did that before President Trump came in. So the president righted that. He went to Detroit and said, that was not the agreement. We're going to reject that, and we're going to do it in due course and do it in April of 2018. That's what we just announced. And what I announced was that those standards that were set, the 54 miles per gallon, should be revised. They're not appropriate. And that shouldn't be terribly surprising, because what has happened over the years as these CAFE standards have been instituted, they've been instituted in a way to try to coerce, again, market-based, coerce people toward buying vehicles that they don't want to buy.
Right.
So a certain percentage of your fleet being electric vehicles or what have you. And what the American people have, the consumer trends, the consumer purchasing, cost of gas is $1 cheaper than what they expected. There's many factors that really don't match up with 2011 toward and this midterm evaluation that we have to adjust. And what our focus should be is making sure that cars that are actually purchased by the American people are more efficient. Not having these arbitrary, objectives of saying, a certain percentage of your fleet, Detroit, should be just dedicated to these types of vehicles, hybrids or electrics, that people may not consume. Because if that's the objective, Matt and Charlie, people to stay on older vehicles, which means that the very purposes of the act are being defeated because of higher emissions from the older vehicles. So we want that, and DOT has a very important role in this, Secretary Chow and others, and safety is a major part of it as well. So we're going to get it right. There's a rulemaking process that will take place now, but the response by auto dealers, the auto sector, by the consuming public, I think has been extraordinary, very supportive of the last couple of days.
Right. Let's talk about the renewable fuel standard and ethanol. Obviously, that's
not a very controversial issue at all.
Yeah, not at all. And
can we do Minnie's piece as well?
Yes, right. We'll make sure we have time for that.
Yeah.
But I know that there are different views inside the administration. I know there's a fight up on Capitol Hill between Senator Ted Cruz of Texas and Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa. But obviously, ethanol is is an issue that does contribute to the cost of food. The mandate does contribute to the cost of food. Obviously, it affects gasoline. I mean, there's political issues and there's policy issues related to that. And I know there's a review of the RFS mandate. Where does that stand, and kind of how do you approach that?
Well, the agency historically. We have certain obligations on the statute. I mean, we administer the statute,
right?
So I didn't adopt it, didn't vote for it, but at the same time, I have a job to administer it. And as an example, every November, the agency is required to issue volume obligations. It's the mandate. This is where cellulosic or the advanced category should be, or conventional ethanol. The blending, like conventional was 15 billion gallons in the marketplace this year of 143 billion gallons that are consumed on average nationally. So we set those volume and mandates every November. The agency has typically not met that deadline. We met it last year. We'll meet it this year. I made a commitment to do so because it's only fair to make sure that people have certainty in the marketplace. But as we look at the current dynamic, what is most troubling is this RIN market. And I don't know if folks have followed this RIN market very closely, but it's something called the Renewable Identification Number. It's an accounting mechanism to ensure that these fuels are blended in the fuel stock. And so it's an enforcement mechanism. Guess who pays the RIN? Refiners.
Right.
They don't blend. So what's happening is you have refiners across the country that are paying substantial amounts of money in this RIN trading platform that is terribly volatile. So it's putting refineries at risk, and it really doesn't go in many instances, to the heart of what we're trying. What's the objective of the statute is. So we're trying to get RIN reform. That there's been a lot of discussions about that the last month and a half. Lots of folks involved in that. Secretary Pruitt, myself, obviously the White House, we're trying to find answers to get reform on that RIN trading platform and the volatility of cost, while also recognizing the president's commitment to ethanol. Because he's been very, very strong in that regard. So I believe there's a path forward. There are ideas that have been put out that I think are workable. It's just a matter of building consensus around those that I think will help address some of the challenges that we see on both sides of the ledger.
Does the Farm Bill play into this to some extent as well?
I don't know.
Sort of.
The Farm Bill, perhaps. I think what plays into it more probably, and it's interesting that it follows your CAFE question.
Yeah.
95 octane, high octane fuel is something the agencies never looked at as far as mitigating emissions under the CAFE and GHG. And Europe has high octane. It received well, manufacturers build it. So one of the things we need to look at going forward that the ethanol industry, the oil and gas industry, auto industry would all be very, I think, supportive and excited about is a high octane approach to address some of those CAFE, GHG type of discussions around mobile sources that you talked about a minute ago. I think that presents an opportunity for us.
Right. Let's get to one other thing, and then a couple of these other items are in the news as we finish up here with you. This is a Oklahoma question to some extent, but does have an oil and gas angle. I don't know if you follow this teacher strike in Oklahoma, but it looked like there was a proposal to tax the oil and gas industry to try to make up for the raise that was being offered to the teachers. Is that something that has it all been on your radar?
I've had.
I know you've been busy.
I've had enough to say grace over, Matt, but no, I haven't. I haven't weighed in on that.
Yeah, no, I understood. I mean, Oklahoma issue, but okay. So you mentioned the Paris Climate Accord. Obviously, as you mentioned, as you implied, I mean, there was a bit of debate inside the administration. I know a lot of that is kept private. But as I was thinking about it, I mean, if you look at most of the other Republican candidates who ran for president in 2016, it's not clear to me that there are very many people on there who they won would have pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement.
Yeah, Matt, I think you're spot on.
But explain, though, to people why that matters. I mean, the argument against it is that there's a sort of a diplomatic cost to pulling out of a multilateral agreement like that.
I understand that. There was a few arguments. One was that it was non-binding.
Right.
The Paris Accord was a voluntary agreement. That was not true. And let me tell you why it wasn't true. We went to Paris as a country, and we put into place targets, 26 to 28% reduction targets with CO2.
Right.
And brought that back, and the Clean Power Plan was adopted largely pursuant to those targets.
Right.
What people don't realize is that every rule that the Obama administration adopted, Clean Power Plan, methane-related, et cetera, still fell 40% short of the target set in Paris. and there's a section in the Clean Air Act, Section 115 in the Clean Air Act, that talks about international agreements. And the statute and the language in the statute actually talks about reciprocity and reciprocal obligations and whatnot. There were law review articles being written in the summer of 2016 about how Section 115 of the Clean Air Act could be used to do what? Compel additional regulatory response by the EPA beyond the Clean Power Plan because it fell 40% short. So these arguments that it was non-binding were simply not accurate.
Right.
Secondly, when you think about what happened in Paris, if it was about CO2 reduction, the reason I said it was a bumper sticker is because it was not really about CO2. Because if it was about CO2 reduction, you wouldn't have let China, as part of this agreement, have to wait until 2030 to take any steps to reduce anything. And you wouldn't have said to India, you get a chance to wait till 2030. And oh, by the way, also receive $2.5 trillion in aid. So it was truly an anti-competitive. The reason the rest of the world applauded our involvement is because it put us at an economic disadvantage, and we front-loaded the cost.
And they all made out like bandits.
Absolutely. And moreover, let me ask you, and then just think about it. And why would we ever do that when we're leading the world in the reduction anyway?
Right.
When I was at the G7 a week after the Paris decision, and I met with my counterparts, bilateral meetings with Germany, Japan, et cetera, United Kingdom, and the rest. Obviously, they were focused upon the decision.
Yeah.
And in each of those meetings, I asked them in response, you're so upset about what we've done with Paris. Let me ask you what happened after we exited Kyoto. When President Bush exited the Kyoto, what happened with our CO2 reduction? And oh, by the way, here's what we've achieved over the last decade or more. What have you achieved?
Right.
Listen, I mean, we do it better than anybody in the world. Travel to Beijing and look at the air quality, compare it to here, and we grow our economy and also, I believe, balance and find stewardship, as far as our environment in a very effective way. We do it better than anybody. We have nothing to be apologetic about.
So I do want to get to these last couple things as we wrap up, and I want to read you something that there are a couple, I think, people on Twitter, influential people like Hugh Hewitt and Kim Strassel have been making this argument. I want to read you something that Hugh Hewitt tweeted a couple days ago when some of this stuff was in the news, and I subscribe to this. I want to get your reaction to it. He said, "Not surprised in the least that environmental left and its allies in the mainstream media are targeting Administrator Pruitt. He's by far the most effective cabinet member in advancing Trump's deregulation agenda. The only thing they fear more than Pruitt at EPA is Pruitt at DOJ. I won't ask you about perhaps moving to a different office, but I mean, obviously, there have been questions about travel and questions about accommodations for you that have come up. I know you've answered some of those questions last day or so, and if you want to answer them again here, I think people would like to hear those answers. But do you believe that this is kind of, they're using these issues to try to get rid of you, to try to put pressure on you, to try to make you defensive because of the agenda and the things that you're working on?
I mean, I think it is a focus of distraction. I mean, I think it's noise that it's been noisy and competitive since day one, because this agency has been a bastion of liberalism since day one.
Yeah.
And
a weapon.
And when we do things differently, and I will tell you, and this is what's frustrating, when you look at doing Superfund sites better, when you look at improving air quality, as we're doing through rulemaking that's consistent with the statute and working with states on state implementation plans, we had 700 state implementation plans that were sitting on a shelf at the EPA. States had spent time and money submitting plans on how to improve air quality. The past administration didn't even respond to them. So air quality, water quality, and as we are making progress there and also reducing the regulatory burden, it is infuriating to those that have dominated and controlled the agency for years. So it's been noisy and competitive since day one. I've told our team all the way through this process, focus on results. Keep your head down, stay focused, and I have to tell myself that today.
Yeah.
Because I believe these issues that are being used against me are exactly because of that. This housing issue, frankly, Matt, career ethics officials at the EPA, the Office of General Counsel and career ethics officials have reviewed the lease and have determined that there are no ethical concerns, that it's market value. I mean, what I did my wife was not here yet, my children were not here yet, my dog wasn't here. I was
temporary situation.
I was living out of a suitcase, and I literally had access to one room in a unit where the common area and access by others occurred all the time.
Right.
And so if I can pull up comps, in fact, the ethics officials did this, pull up comps. It was like an Airbnb situation,
right,
where I paid for it when I was there. I paid for the small space I had. Everything else was common area access, and people could come and go as they wished. And so this was not something, in fact, it's done all the time. And so career ethics officials looked at that and spoke to that issue. Yeah. So, it is, to me, an example. You asked earlier, Charlie, about what I see as a challenge. It is this, as far as the distractions, around these kinds of things. The travel, it is absolutely. I went to the G7. People are criticizing me going to the G7, as I mentioned to you, a week after Paris. Right. I was there for 4 days, from Thursday to Sunday. I had a cabinet meeting on Monday, and you know what I was criticized then about, Matt? That I left too early. Today, to give you how crazy this is, I got an inquiry today. I won't tell you the publication. It wasn't you guys. Yeah. I got an inquiry today. This last August, I had knee surgery. It required knee surgery. I had complications from back in Oklahoma. You schedule those things, as you know, pretty far in advance. Yeah. So it was during recess, while the president was Mar-a-Lago, et cetera. And so I scheduled this, had complications, and had physical therapy. So they were calling and actually inquiring about, my time in Oklahoma during this time frame. Yeah. The next inquiry is going to be, do you like brown shoes or black shoes? Well, right? So it gets frustrating.
So last thing, let's just wrap up. So, I mean, are you as...
Is there a fire alarm?
I don't know what's going on there. We'll blow through it. But, I mean, are you as kind of focused and positive and, determined as you've ever been? Because, I mean, if you go through the record, obviously, you said 22 major actions, $1 billion in savings. I mean, some significant things that you're working on, some significant things you still have ahead of you. But obviously, it's been a difficult few days for you, I'm sure.
Charlie and we were talking about baseball a minute ago. Yeah. And I played college baseball. I went to pre-draft workouts my junior and senior year with the Reds. I mean, and I'll tell you, what I learned about baseball is that you get hit, hits 3 times out of 10, you make a lot of money in the big leagues, right? But you fail 7 times out of 10.
Right.
You have to persevere. I'm leaning in on these issues.
Yeah.
You know, when somebody throws a high fastball up and in, what I used to do is get back in the box and dare them to throw it back inside.
Yep. Get right up on the plate.
And so, because you know what? I could turn on it and knock it down the left field line. So what we're doing is absolutely focus. In the midst of all this, what did we announce yesterday? Midterm evaluation.
Right.
On Friday, we've got an executive order on additional changes on the NACS program. Monday, we've got additional meetings with respect to the RFS. I mean, look, we are getting things done, and that's what's driving these folks crazy. And I will tell you, the truth and the facts are on our side, and we're just going to keep pushing and keep telling the story and trusting the American people get it.
We will leave a discussion of the Red River rivalry to a future occasion. You can follow our guest, Administrator Scott Pruitt, on Twitter at EPA Scott Pruitt. He's been our guest here on the Mack on Politics podcast with the Washington Times. Administrator, thank you so much for being a guest here.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks,
Appreciate
Charlie.
it.
Great to see you.
Likewise.